Okay, so now we're just going to go on to the next bit of network topology, and this will be the final bit. And what we're going to do here is we're going to focus on a corollary of the scale-free model, and that's this notion of hubs, and then we're going to, which act as kind of points of centrality in the network. And then we're going to talk about other ways of calculating centrality in networks, and this is a very useful concept. And so we're going to finish up with networks by talking about that with a little bit more biological connection. So first we'll talk about hubs. So again, in the ER network, the degree distribution, that's the distribution of nodes with a given degree, okay, follows this power law formula, and it, on a log graph, it will be straight. And then obviously what that means is there's a few things down here in the degree distribution that really have a lot of connections. And those are, of course, hubs in your network. And one of the interesting things about this is these hubs really become special places in the network, and they dictate the structure of the network. And I think that becomes a way of understanding the network structure. So one thing right away you can see is the network has a kind of different type of robustness and fragility if it's a scale-free network versus a random network. So you can see that because the connectivity of the scale-free network is really dictated by a few hubs, just a very few, it's actually very robust to random attack. It's much more, and random attack means kind of like knocking out a node or knocking out a connection. So if you take your random network and you kind of attack it and you knock out pieces of it, it'll break apart pretty quickly. And by break apart, it means, for instance, if this was a road network, you'll no longer be able to, say, drive across the United States, because you'll have broken, if you randomly attack this network, many of the connections you would need to make a path across the United States. Whereas if you take a look at the airline network, if you just randomly attack this network, you'll still be able pretty easily to get across the United States. And that's because only a few nodes, which are improbable to be attacked, because there's only a few of them, are really dictating the structure of the network. So the scale-free network is actually very robust to accidental node failure. However, of course, the converse is that it's extremely vulnerable to attack on the node. So if you look at the scale-free network and you say, oh, I want to disrupt this network, it's obvious that if you just attack these nodes with just a sort of a small number of attacks, you'll completely destroy the network with a very small number of sort of node failures. And so it kind of changes the robustness profile of the network. Now, this is very important in terms of biological networks, because what people did was they looked at protein-protein interaction networks and regulatory networks and so forth, and they found that they often had a scale-free topology. And then what they were able to do is they were able to correlate the essentiality, or how important to an organism a given gene was in these networks, to its hubbiness. And basically, what they found in many different contexts was that hubs tend to be essential. And maybe that makes sense, but it really makes sense if you think about the what I just told you about the robustness to attack. So a scale-free topology actually is a very robust framework for protecting your network, because you can have all sorts of changes and attacks on your network, and it won't mess up the essential connectivity, except, of course, for your central nodes. And they have to be very protected. And one way of saying they're very protected is they're very essential in a biological context. And actually, what one things people have found is that the hubs in scale-free biological networks, such as protein interaction networks or regulatory networks, they tend to they tend to be more conserved. They tend to, the proteins tend to evolve more slowly. There's many measures of how fast things evolve for, like, DNDS would be one particular measure, or there's population genetic things. And in many different contexts, regulatory networks, microRNA networks, protein interaction networks, whatever, people have found that the hubs tend to be more conserved. And here's a picture actually of the human protein-protein interaction network. And what we have here is the more rapidly evolving things are colored in red. And just the way this placement algorithm works, the things on the outside tend to be less likely to be hubs. And the overall picture you have is, I like to say that connectivity is associated with constraint. So the more connectivity you have on a node, the more constraint, the more conservation you have for that particular node. Okay, so that's looking at hubs. Let's look at other measures of centrality. So another measure of centrality is the notion of bottlenecks. So remember, hubs are essentially found from looking at the degree distribution, okay? There's another measure that you can look at, which is the betweenness of a node. And the betweenness of a node speaks to how many of the shortest paths, remember we talked about shortest paths, how many shortest paths in the network go through that node. So if you look at all the shortest paths, say the shortest path between this and this, this and this, and then you look at the path they traverse and you count how many shortest paths go through every particular node, a node with high betweenness or a bottleneck will have many shortest paths going through them. And people think of this metric as a measure of information flow. And I think a good way of getting intuition about bottlenecks and betweenness is think about the road network on the East Coast of the United States, where we live. If you've ever driven through this network, you realize that there's only a limited number of ways of crossing some of the big rivers. In particular, one of the big rivers on the East Coast is the Hudson River. This is a picture of the Hudson River. And there's only a relatively limited number of places you can cross the Hudson River. And one of the most prominent is this structure here, which is called the George Washington Bridge. And so this acts as a bottleneck for all the cars or information packets traveling up and down the East Coast. They have to make their shortest path from wherever they want to go, Boston to Washington, New York to Baltimore, whatever. They have to go through this, these nodes and edges, and that makes this thing a bottleneck. Now, I should point out a bottleneck can also be a hub. It doesn't have to be a hub. You can imagine here, for instance, here's a bottleneck node that is a hub. Here's one that's not a hub. And likewise, you can have a hub that's not a bottleneck, and conversely. Biologically, people have often found bottlenecks bridging disparate genomic processes. So if you have two processes here, often they're connected in some regulatory or interaction sense through a bottleneck edge. And I'm not going to describe it in detail, but there's a particular algorithm that people use to calculate betweenness. It's called the Dijkstra algorithm. It's a very famous graph algorithm that uses dynamic programming, and this is what you would use to calculate betweenness and bottlenecks. So another measure of centrality, let's continue going on, is hierarchy or tops of hierarchy. And let's start out here with a intuitive notion. So this is a picture of the org chart of Apple Computer from years ago. I don't know if people remember this. This is when Steve Jobs was the head of Apple Computer, and he was the tyrant at the top of this organization. And here's all the people that report to him, including here's Tim Cook, the current CEO, and then all the other people. And the key idea is that this directed organizational chart really gave you a sense of, it's sort of like a hub, but it's a different type of thing, that someone sits at the top of a regulatory network. And that really points to the importance of that person. Now, one thing we might want to do in a biological network is we might want to find the equivalent of the Steve Jobs, in the regulatory network that's really regulating a lot of things. And how might we systematically do that? Well, if we have a directed network, remember, we can measure what's called the out degree of a node. That's the number of things it regulates, versus the in degree. That's the number of things that regulate it. And obviously, things that sit at the top of a hierarchy are going to have very low in degree and progressively higher out degree. And then obviously things that sit at the bottom of the hierarchy will essentially have just in degree, but not out degree. And so we can kind of look at the difference between these two quantities and think about placing things on a hierarchy in relation to that difference. And there's a variety of different ways of doing this. Here's a non-hierarchy directed network, and here you can imagine how you might sort of put it into a hierarchy. You'd find all the terminal nodes, the things that just have in degree, you put them at the bottom. You then, in a kind of breadth first way, you'd find all the things that connect to these or regulate those, you'd put them on the next level, and then you'd find something that maybe regulates those things and so forth. And so that's one way. Another way of doing this might be some sort of simulated annealing algorithm where you would move things between levels and you would see if it would optimize this hierarchy height type of structure. Now, here's a picture where I actually show, this is the human regulatory network. This is actually in a particular cell, and here is it put into a hierarchy using one of those optimization approaches. And in this approach, all the downward pointing edges are shown in green, but there's a few upward pointing edges shown in red. And what's interesting, I think, about these hierarchy pictures is that they give you a lot of intuition about what's going on regulatorily. Obviously, these things up top are more of the master regulators. You know, these things at the bottom are more the regulated. And what's particularly interesting is that it's almost by necessity, but this middle level of the hierarchy where there's lots of paths go through, if you calculate the average betweenness of these levels, obviously in the middle of a hierarchy, you're going to get higher betweenness, and you're going to have more bottlenecks or information flow bottlenecks. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about when we think about the structure of networks. Okay, so I think with that, I'm finished with the centrality